and welcome to a special episode of The Collector's Corner, brought to you by the Washington Arms Collectors. This is a special episode because together we are composing the final chapter of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, The Armed Citizen. You've done your part by sending your questions to jamesatthewack@gmail or posting them in comments below. Pause, take a moment, like, and above all, subscribe. I am gratified by all my viewers, but I especially appreciate my subscribers because together we are sharing in the century-old great game. And in due course, we'll speak more about the great game and future directions of this YouTube channel. Unpause. I must do my part now to give us a perfectly blended educational martini to enjoy. Our first few sips are delicious off-ramps. Someone wants to know, are there firearms in the stories of H.P. Lovecraft? No. However, in his correspondence, he speaks of the soothing feel of a rifle, and Lovecraft did inherit his grandfather's sizable firearms collection. Someone else wants to know, will we be taking a look at the firearms of pulp fiction detectives? Sadly, no. However, when we turn our eye upon the cinematic representations of Mr. Holmes's firearms, there will be significant overlap. Stay tuned for Basil and Bruce. Others want to know, will we be exploring Victorian shotguns? I said yes, then I said no. Now I offer a stout-hearted maybe. And maybe because in The Adventure of the Glorious Scott, we are told that the college-age Mr. Holmes was a waterfowl shooting enthusiast. Victorian shotguns on the horizon? Maybe. Liz wants to know, is Sherlock Holmes a real person? Well, that is an excellent question, and we want to answer this truthfully, fully, and to the best of our ability. And yes, Liz, there is was a Sherlock Holmes. Oh, you're surprised. Well, it turns out his name wasn't Sherlock Holmes. It was actually Joe Bell. He was a medical professor at Edinburgh. Joe Bell was known for the method. And his method was to bring someone into his operating theater surrounded by his medical students who'd paid £4 a class to be instructed by him. And he would bring a patient in and he would deduce facts about their life, profession, and disease after only a few moments of intense observation. An example. One day into the theater came a woman who appeared to be one of the slightly lower class, and Mr. Joe Bell said very politely, "Ma'am, where is your cutter?" She looked about a little bit surprised, perhaps slightly embarrassed. "No, ma'am, there's no need to be embarrassed. Where is your cutter pipe?" She reached into her bag, took out her short clay pipe. How did Joe Bell know that? Well, he saw on her lip a glossy place which was worn by the pipe. Moreover, on her cheek there was a burn mark from when she'd lit the pipe, which was a short clay pipe, and it had been too warm for her face. All that Joe Bell deduced in just a moment. So yes, this became the basis for the character of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. And guess who Joe Bell's dresser was? The person who assisted him. Arthur Conan Doyle. So yes, Liz, there was a Sherlock Holmes. Now someone else asks what seems an elementary question. Did Mr. Sherlock Holmes shoot anyone? However, this leads to palate-pleasing commentary and questions. Now, before I explore what we've already spoken of a little bit in Chapter 3, the shooting of the Adamant Islander named Tonga, I would like to say that firearms prevent violence in the stories of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, And often, the mere brandishing of a firearm by Mr. Holmes or Dr. Watson defuses explosive situation. And that brings us back around to the shooting of Tonga, the Thames, and a travelogue. The shooting was here on the River Thames. Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson were shooting by starlight. And they were shooting at a moving target. They weren't on a Thames river cruiser. Instead, they were on a police launch. They were buffeted and bounced by the wake of the steam launch Aurora. Now, we see how a seemingly elementary question, who did Mr. Holmes shoot, leads us inevitably to how he shot, skillfully. Consider, there were 4 human occupants of the Aurora and 1 non-human occupant. A stray or careless bullet might have killed an innocent child or a moderately innocent father of the child who was the captain of the Aurora. But a bullet striking the non-human occupant could have been devastating. The non-human occupant was, of course, the steam boiler of the Aurora. A stray bullet puncturing that. Best worst-case scenario, the occupants of the Aurora are scalded. Worst-case scenario, a catastrophic explosion with the Aurora obliterated as well as the police launch, including Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Inspector Jones. What was called for in the shooting of Tonga was the most accurate, the most deliberate trigger action. And we see how they shot leads inevitably to what they shot and the nature of Holmes' old favorite and Watson's old service revolver. In the shooting of Tonga, they required single action capability, which is inherently more accurate. Now let me demonstrate single action versus double action in a revolver. Here we have a Colt 1873 single action. In single action, the pulling of the trigger does one action or one duty only. It releases a previously cocked hammer. In double action, and here I have a price-type revolver retailed by Guy E. Moncrief, that's a whole nother interesting story, which has double action capability. In double action, the pulling of the trigger is more arduous because it has to do double duty or double action. It must not only release the hammer, it must bring the hammer back so it can be released. It is inherently less accurate. The revolvers I suggested for the Old Favorite and the Old Service revolver both possess single action capability in the Metropolitan and in the Adams Service revolver. Now, interestingly enough, they both have double action capability as well. And in one of the stories involving an enormous canine, I think you call it a hound, the swiftness of double action trigger work was necessary. And of course, I'm reminded of the famous piece of correspondence where a Crimean War veteran wrote the Adams factory praising their revolver, for he said if he had a Colt single action, his response wouldn't have been swift enough to stop the 4 Russian soldiers which charged him, and he would have been fatally skewered. Also, someone reminds us of the height, the depth, and the breadth of Victorian revolver making when they mentioned the Price, they mentioned the Francote, they mentioned the 5-shot Tranter revolver available in the 1870s. And doubtless some of those revolvers might have worked as the Old Favorite and the Old Service revolver, though some of them lack single action capability. But what we must remember, for an arms enthusiast like Mr. Holmes, stasis is death. Stasis, an unchanging aspect, is fine for a work of sculpture, but for an arms collection, it must always be expanding or contracting depending upon one's interests or one's finances. And in the 20-plus years Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson lived in Baker Street, they may have owned a whole variety of revolvers, including the Francote, the Price, and the 5-shot Tranter. Now, Dr. Watson's arms collection doubtless evolved. Some of you mentioned that Watson may have found tedious hauling around an over 2.5-pound revolver, the Adams revolver, and perhaps also a bit clumsy trying to carry it concealed, though I would note it is possible. Not concealed in a trouser pocket, however. In fact, the engineering of trousers is such that if you added the weight of a fully loaded Adams revolver, you would probably have to reinforce belt with suspenders with super glue to avoid having the trousers down around your ankle. Watson, at some point, I'm convinced, traded the Great Dane revolver, the Adams, for a more dainty breed, the Webley British Bulldog. At half the weight, less than half the size, it still had a loud bark and a vicious bite. By the way, nowhere in the canonical stories are holsters mentioned. They're always carried in the trouser pockets or the overcoat pocket. However, at some point we may take a look at the kit Watson had as a soldier of the Second Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, and then we may examine holsters. Now, I mentioned that we were going to take a look at some of the new directions we're going with this YouTube channel. We have, as you've probably seen, a series of shorts have dropped, but we intend to have more lengthy items in this sub-channel 221 Ballistic. We intend, in fact, to use in our studies not only exegesis, or the careful studying of the canonical writings of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, but experimentation and trying to reenact some of the firearms work. And I must say, I am looking forward to seeing what sort of reaction I get when I begin firing black powder cartridges inside the sitting room, shooting a VR into the wall. I also hope to solicit the help of someone who's done special effects for Hollywood for some of these 221 ballistic efforts. I'd also like to tease you with some titles that you're going to see in the coming months. Something titled Drabs, Stabs, and the Guns of Scotland Yard, or What Did the Inspector Have in His Trouser Pocket? This will be a look at the most notorious unsolved series of gruesome murders, the Whitechapel murders, commonly called the Jack the Ripper murders. And in an episode entitled Tiger, Tiger, a Sniper in Baker Street, we'll take a look at that sniper that everyone loves to hate, Colonel Sebastian Moran. It will include not only Victorian air rifles, but of all things, Howdah pistols and brand new factoids, never published, never before discussed, about the attempted assassination of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. We've got some fascinating features that we filmed in Baker Street that I think you'll enjoy. And finally, we'll come back to the tragedy of Tonga in an episode entitled Autopsies, Anomalies, and the Andaman Islander. And we make a side trip to the Thames River Police for that particular episode. Now, I mentioned the Great Game. I would like to quote the Sherlockian Vincent Stirrett, who in a poem 221b, his opening lines are, "Here dwell together still two men of note, who never lived and so can never die. In the great game, which has gone on since the end of the 19th century, people attempt to bring in these undying heroes of ours, Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, into our historical reality. You have gifted me with the opportunity of bringing them into the facticity of Victorian and Edwardian firearms, and I am extremely grateful for that. Now, you've asked some marvelous questions and had some wonderful comments. I hope I've answered at least some of your questions. I would like now to ask you a question, to play a bit of the great game. And the question is, where did the iconic manacled hands come from? Were they created by the P.T. Barnum patriarch of the family, Philip Webley? Were they created by the Gordon Gekko eldest son, who had the business acumen, Thomas Webley? Or did a heretofore unnamed person who had art in the blood design that famous logo which represented the triumph of good over evil? And in my searching, which I did recently, of Webley's sometimes charred, always scattered records, did I in fact find a ledger book that indicates an S. Holmes for the price of 24 shillings 6 and the reward of the very first prototype of the Webley Metropolitan design, the manacled hands. Might it be that the world's first private consulting detective was also the world's first firearm collecting and advising detective? Now, let us go to our usual sign-off in the form of a travelogue. We hope you've enjoyed the conclusion of this fourth chapter of our episode, Sherlock Holmes, the Armed Citizen. Now, until our next episode, please keep your powder dry, your money ready, and both eyeballs scun for those amazing historical items or fantastic bargains you might find on the tables of the Washington Arms Collectors or our beloved sister organization, the Oregon Arms Collectors. Now, I think I'm going to enjoy this lovely little pub.